they're shooting already. Hi.
Can we get you nice and comfy, Josh?
Yeah. Hello, I am Bob Desimone, director of the McGovern Institute at MIT. Welcome to tonight's discussion, which is co-sponsored with the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. It is stimulated by the new PBS series, Brains on Trial, at the intersection of neuroscience and the law, which could not be a more timely topic given the events of the last couple days. The host of the series and our host tonight is Alda, the 7-time Emmy Award-winning actor, writer, director. Myself, and I'm sure most of you here, first became acquainted with Alan in the hit television show MASH, of course about the Mobile Army Field Hospital in the Korean War. Alan not only starred in the series, but he also wrote and directed many of the episodes. He also wrote 2 best-selling books, including What I Overheard When I Was Talking to Myself, starred in many subsequent TV shows, movies, but maintained his interest in medicine, I guess, having been through the medical war, and became an effective communicator of science. He was the host of the Scientific American Frontier series. He won an award from the National Science Board for his public service in communicating science to the public. And we here at the McGovern Institute feel we have a special connection to Alan. Alan spoke at our anniversary event in 2010. He came at the end of a long line of scientist speakers, like myself, who used the time to present data on our slides and so on. And then in Alan's presentation, he got up and he told us scientists that if we wanted to effectively communicate about our science, we should ditch all those slides and just learn how to talk effectively to people. And of course, as being highly trained scientists, we ignored that advice. But I am proud to say I have gotten through this entire introduction without a single data slide.
I know, fantastic, bravo. But you could have shown a picture of one of my Emmys.
I give you Al.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming tonight, and thanks to the McGovern Institute and to Bob Desimone, the director, for having us here tonight. And here's what it's about. For the last couple of years, Graham, Chad, and I have been working on a 2-part special for PBS, which concerns itself with the implications for the justice system of the ability of brain science now to peer into people's brains. Bringing together those 2 disciplines that up until now seemed far apart and now are very close together, increasingly close together in any case. The first show was last Wednesday night. Tomorrow night will be the second show. And just to give you an idea of what the program is like and what our conversation will be based on, I'd like to run you a clip from the beginning of the second episode. Could we see that clip? Hello, I'm Alan Alda. This is the courthouse in Lower Manhattan, where we've been filming the trial of a young man accused of the all-too-common crime of robbing a convenience store. A robbery that, in this case, turned into a tragedy. Startled by the sudden appearance of the store owner's wife, Jimmy Moran fired a shot that left her with a grievous brain injury. The crime is fictitious.
All right, we'll call the case of People versus Moran.
But during the emotional trial of the character Jimmy Moran, the case was argued before a very real and distinguished federal judge by practicing attorneys.
The defendant, Jimmy Moran, is holding his gun.
Everything that happens here happens in a matter of less than 10 seconds.
During the course of filming the trial, we took breaks from the courtroom to explore how neuroscience, in particular the ability to look into people's heads with powerful brain scanning machines, may one day be employed in a real trial. We saw how brain scans could potentially reveal whether someone has told a lie.
You want to find out if I did?
I do.
Whether an eyewitness remembers a face, or if a defendant has the crime scene etched in his brain.
Has the jury reached a verdict?
Yes, Your Honor.
Our trial concluded its first phase with the jury clearing Jimmy Moran of attempted murder, but finding him guilty of armed robbery and aggravated assault.
The jury's job is done, and now it's up to the judge to decide on a punishment that fits the crime. How much blame should Jimmy take for what he did? How responsible is he for the devastating brain injury he caused? What does he deserve? Judges are already beginning to turn to brain science for answers to these questions. In our fictional case, we'll see how that science is providing unprecedented insights into the minds of young people like our defendant.
And why his age, his troubled childhood, even the mere presence of his friends, can all conspire to push him into foolish and reckless acts.
Let me introduce our panelists to you. First, our host, Bob Desimone. Bob is the director of the McGovern Institute and a professor in MIT's Department of Brain and Cognitive Science. From 2008 to 2010, he served as network co-director of the MacArthur Law and Neuroscience Project. Nancy Canwisher, on Bob's left, was a founding member of the McGovern Institute and also a professor in MIT's Department of Brain and Cognitive Science. The Canwisher Lab uses brain imaging to study the functional organization of the human brain. Josh Green is from next door at Harvard, where he's associate professor of the social sciences in the psychology department. His research focuses on the interplay of emotion and reasoning in moral decision-making. He's also been a valuable advisor to our Brains on Trial project since the beginning. Bea Luna is professor of psychiatry at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine, where she directs the Laboratory of Neurocognitive Development. As you'll see a little later, she leads research projects exploring impulsivity in adolescence, as well as the occasional older visitor like me. Stephen Morse is professor of law, professor of psychology, and associate director of the Center for Neuroscience and Society at the University of Pennsylvania. He was instrumental in building the MacArthur Law and Neuroscience Project. So let's get to the first topic, folks. It's maybe one of the most controversial questions in the interface of the law and neuroscience. The question of whether or not brain imaging can tell if somebody is lying. We went out to an MRI facility in Framingham where there was a company called CFOS that was marketing MRI lie detection. And I got in their scanner, and the idea was to find out if they could tell if I was lying, and not just to determine if they could do it, but to see how it worked. What's the process they go through? How do they try to determine if you're lying or not? So I was left alone in a room, and I was told to take from a drawer either a ring or a watch. Here's what happened. The ring or the watch? I'm really tempted to take them both.
Is the ring in your locker?
No.
Did you take the ring?
No.
Did you steal the ring?
No.
Was the ring stolen?
No.
Did you hide the ring?
No.
Did you steal
Next
it?
came a
No.
practice session when I honed my skill at denying everything.
No.
which of course meant that half the time I'm lying.
Did you put the ring in your locker?
No.
Did you leave the ring in the drawer?
Yes.
Did the ring stay in the drawer?
Yes.
Was the ring moved from the drawer?
Not by me.
Did you hide the watch in your locker?
No.
Did you remove a watch from the drawer?
No.
Did you steal a watch from the drawer?
You gotta get a rubber hose, you know? Make this go much faster.
This right here is the keypad.
Now it's time for the brain scan. The keypad will allow me to answer yes or no as the questions are projected onto a screen above my face. While I'm in the scanner, you get the pleasure of seeing my brain revealed. This is a structural scan. But once the questions start coming, the machine will be making repeated scans to see how different parts of my brain are responding as I answer. This type of brain scan is called a functional MRI, and it's the key technology we'll be encountering as we explore how neuroscientists are probing brains. The scanner creates images of multiple slices through the brain, picking out regions where a cluster of nerve cells, among the several billion in the brain, is working especially hard. Harder working cells need more blood to fuel them. This extra blood flowing through the nest of capillaries surrounding the nerve cells generates a magnetic signal. And it's this signal, an indirect measure of nerve cell activity, that the fMRI machine detects and displays.
What do you think I took out of the drawer?
The computer made the determination that you took the ring.
Uh-huh. You want to find out if I did?
I do. All right. Very good.
You look a little relieved. I think I should point out that a few months after we filmed this show, Steve Lakin stopped offering fMRI lie detection in his company. I don't know why he stopped, but I think at least one member of our panel is really happy he did. Nancy, you made your feelings really clear on the show about that kind of effort to determine if somebody's lying using a brain scan. How do you feel about this test?
Well, I think it doesn't really work. I think it may be that someday, with advances that we can't imagine now, it's remotely possible that would happen. But right now, nobody has shown anything even remotely close to real lie detection. So what they've shown is, and probably what he picked up on this scan, is that if you ask people to say something that's not true versus something that's true, it takes a little bit more mental effort to say something that's not true. And so that produces very systematic activations in the brain. They can be replicated. There's extra mental activity. But it's not diagnostic mental activity. If he had done this experiment and said, we think that you took that ring, and we are going to test and find out if you are innocent or not. And what we're going to do is we're going to find out if you respond differentially during that time. So in other words, if you were suspected and if a lot was at stake, it's quite possible all of the same brain activity would happen.
So the way he's doing this with me is in a highly controlled environment. I didn't really steal anything. As a matter of fact, that was my ring and my watch.
Right.
So it wasn't even a question of determining if I was guilty of an act that I could perhaps go to jail for. It was really just looking at the brain activity while I was supposedly lying.
Exactly. And so, for this to be of any use at all in the real world, you'd need to test it under those circumstances that could make all the difference in brain scanning. That is major stakes, not $50 as in a psychology experiment, but life in prison, right? And you need to test it where the person at the time of the scanning believes that this scan could determine their fate. You'd need to actually have a gold standard of whether to determine later whether they were telling the truth or not. I can't imagine how you'd ever do that experiment.
Josh, you do scans similar to but what are you looking for in the brain, and why are you doing these scans?
So the most relevant experiment addresses precisely the issue that Nancy raised, and if anything, raises further doubts about the interpretation behind the method that Lakin was using. So one of Nancy's many excellent points is that you weren't really lying. You were saying something false under the instruction of the experimenters.
But that's a really big distinction, isn't it?
That's a very big distinction.
I mean, he's told me to not tell the truth.
Right.
So would we expect something different to happen in my brain because I'm not deliberately lying?
Right. Yeah. So I and Joe Paxton in my lab did an experiment in which people told real lies, and it wasn't life and death stakes, but it was they were at least real lies. And our setup was like this: we were having people predict the outcomes of these electronic coin flips, and they got money if they could predict correctly, and they lost money if they couldn't predict correctly. And sometimes they had to record their prediction in advance. Okay, heads, and then they get their money or not, depending on whether they turn out to be right. In another condition, in the same experiment, we said, you know what, you don't have to tell us in advance what your prediction is. Just tell us afterwards whether or not you got it right, and we'll trust you. And,
sort of like playing tennis, and you have to decide if it was inside or outside the line.
So you say, oh, right.
I've played with a lot of people like that.
So it's up to you. And we had a cover story. We're interested in people's ability to predict the future, and if some people think that if you have to tell people what your prediction is, then it ruins it. And so people said, okay, well, that sounds very plausible. A few people were suspicious, and we got rid of them.
It's very important in an experiment.
So now we can look at the people who, when they have the opportunity to lie, some people are right at 50% where they should be if they have no magical powers, and other people are at 60, 75%, getting close to 100%. So we have even though on any given trial, we don't know if someone said, oh, I guessed heads and I was right, well, maybe they did, but in aggregate, for a given person, we can see, are they getting too many of these right to be credible? So we can sort people into the people who are very clearly lying, people who show no sign of lying, and the people who are in the middle. And so now we've got this group of people who are almost certainly lying. The odds that they would do as well as they're doing by chance are 1 in 1,000 or even worse. And so the question is, what goes on in those people? Well, it turns out that the same part of the brain, roughly speaking, that Cephos was focusing on, the kind that is reliably activated when people make a special effort to do something, and this can be remembering a phone number or anything like that, prefrontal control network is what it's sometimes called. We saw a lot of activity in the prefrontal control network in these people, more than in the other group. But we saw as much activity there when they claimed a win, often falsely, versus when they let one go and said, you know, I could lie here, but I'm not going to.
So the effort to decide whether or not you're going to lie, to maybe hold yourself back from lying or make the decision to go ahead and do it and evaluate what the risks are, all of that causes prefrontal cortical activity.
So it's a signal of cognitive effort. And in the tidy little controlled experiment that you participated in, it may genuinely be the case that saying an instructed falsehood takes a little more effort than saying the truth. No, but in a more realistic situation, not fully realistic, but one where you're really lying and there really is something, if not everything, at stake, we don't see that distinction. So
were they looking in the same places? Do you think?
You know, roughly, yes. Yeah.
Bob, what do you think? If this is not really going to be able to tell us if someone is lying or not, is there a higher, more important bit of knowledge to be gained from this about how the brain works, about how the brain cooperates in decision making and that kind of thing?
Oh, these are all very valid basic research questions about control processes, how you use networks to make one kind of response that may not be your automatic response, how you make a non-automatic response. These are all very, very valid questions in the field. They're just not directed at whether someone's lying or not. This very practical question. We learned a tremendous amount in cognitive neuroscience from these kinds of cognitive neuro experiments about how all these different brain networks function. So scientists don't have any problem with this kind of research. It's only its use that people raise alarm.
And yet it seems, Stephen, there seems to be a movement toward bringing this into the courtroom. Am I wrong?
Well, not so much for the question of lie detection. That has come up basically in 2 decided cases, and in both cases the judge rejected the use of the evidence for that purpose on the ground that it wasn't.
So did that stop the effort to bring lie detection with MRI into the courtroom, or is it still attempted?
We don't have very good evidence for that right now nationwide. My guess is, since both of these decisions were very clear that it wasn't ready for prime time, my guess is it did put a brake on it. The real question is whether it's being used more for culpability types of decisions or prediction types of decisions.
In what way? What do you mean by that?
Well, a culpability decision would be, can it help us decide whether someone is guilty or not, or what their state of mind was at the time of a crime? A prediction question might be, can you use a brain scan or some sort of neuromarker to add value to a behavioral prediction? After all, we're making predictions all the time in the criminal justice system for things like, should we send this person to prison or not? If in prison, should we grant them parole or not? Questions like that. We're making these predictions now, and the question is, can neuroscience help us make those predictions more accurately?
All right. Not necessarily, though, with regard to lying or telling the truth.
No, not with...
But I would imagine that if you get somebody in a room and you show them this $20 million machine or whatever they cost, and say, we're now going to stick you in here and tell you if you're lying or not, that might get a confession that well, a mere polygraph wouldn't have...
No, that was the interesting thing. The polygraph was very effective for just that reason.
Yeah.
Because people thought this was science and it's going to, in a sense, tell the truth about me. So people would confess, even though, in fact, the polygraph is not a very valid method of lie detection.
Well,
nothing new, Alan.
This is all really reassuring to know. Let's turn to one of the biggest problems in criminal justice. Probably this has always been a problem, and that's the question of how reliable is an eyewitness. In our mock trial, we had a store clerk who was threatened by someone holding a gun in his face, and the question was, were you paying attention to the gun, or were you really looking at the person who was threatening you? And the real question is, does he remember who fired the shot? Take a look at this video. So how did you go from...
Nita Farahani and I have come to Stanford University to see if we can use her brain to answer the question, can a brain scan decode her memory and tell whether or not she's seen a face before? Nita first looks at a set of 200 faces for just 2 seconds per face.
And will my brain remember things that I don't?
Your brain might remember things that you don't.
Wow.
There might be signatures of memory in your brain.
Nita, you ready? You ready to go into the tube?
I am. I'm ready to go in.
Oh, good luck.
Thank you.
Nita settles in for what will be over 2 hours in the MRI machine, while I get to watch with the memory decoder's inventor, Stanford's Anthony Wagner.
And she's going to have to decide for each face on the screen while she's in the scanner, does she recognize it as a face she's recently seen, or is it novel?
Okay, Nita, so this is where we're going to be collecting the brain data of whether you are remembering or whether you're seeing a brand new face.
This time, Nita again sees each face for just 2 seconds, then gets 8 seconds to decide if it's new or familiar. Meanwhile, the MRI is taking scans 2 seconds apart.
Are you looking into her brain specifically focusing on certain areas, or are you looking at patterns of activity all over the brain?
For this study, we're looking at patterns of activity all over the brain. We could look in specific areas, but what we're doing is we're looking at the pattern throughout the brain. Every face she's encountering is generating this complex pattern of activity.
So does that mean that when she recognizes a face that she's seen before, and consciously recognizes it, that's a pattern that shows up pretty much any time she recognizes a face that she's seen before?
Any time is a strong statement.
Okay.
I would,
a lot of the time.
A lot of the time.
Yeah.
So the work that we've done thus far, what we've shown is that on average about 80% of the time,
oh, that's a lot.
We can accurately classify an old face that's recognized as old, and distinguish that pattern from a new face that's perceived as novel.
It sounds like a fingerprint of recognition, not a fingerprint of a face, but of recognition.
That's right. I think what we're looking at is the neural fingerprint or the neural patterns associated with the conscious experience of recognizing a stimulus like a face. That begins to crack open the door. Maybe we would be tempted to use this in the real world.
In a courtroom with it.
Exactly.
For an ordinary civilian like me, this seemed really interesting and intriguing and very attractive. The idea that if somebody recognized a face, you'd be able to know if they recognized that face by scanning them. And that could give you information that they wouldn't willingly give you if they were giving testimony. So that sounded really great. Then I realized that Anthony Wagner was teaching his subjects how to defeat the experiment and make it look like they were getting a record of something going on in the brain that they weren't getting. That, I bet, Nancy, I bet you really like that the researchers are taking kind of a preemptive strike and learning how these tests can be defeated. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, there's actually a funny story about this. In the late 1990s, I did an experiment on mental imagery where I had people close their eyes and imagine a face or imagine a place. And we got such clear, distinctive responses in the brain, different for imagining faces and imagining places, that we ran an experiment where we categorized individual trials, and we could tell 83% correct whether somebody was imagining a face or a place. And when I got those data, this is the late 90s, I thought, oh my God, if we publish this, some numbskull is going to think that you can use this for lie detection. And so for months, I was actually kind of worried about this, and I talked to my boyfriend about it a lot and all my friends, and I couldn't get anybody to worry about it with me, and I finally said, okay, I'll just publish it, and if such numbskulls come along, I'll just have to, publish other experiments to see, whether it could really, whether it could be defeated and such. So I think Anthony's experiment is a beautiful one. It's really nicely done. It's actually scientifically interesting as well. But it's defeatable not just by the countermeasures he's training his subjects to use. It's also worth pointing out that in that experiment, what he found is you could tell, however percent, some reasonable high percent accuracy, whether the face was familiar or not. But actually, you could only tell whether the subject thought it was familiar, not whether it actually was. So it wasn't that by looking at the brain, you could tell anything the subject couldn't tell you.
Yeah.
So it would only be useful for compelling testimony, not for discovering something new.
Right. And Nita Farahani, who did the test, told me that he was trying to determine if it was a familiar face or something novel, a novel face that she was looking at on the screen. So when he showed her a familiar face, she looked at a bolt on the side of the machine and said, wow, what an interesting novel bolt. and so she was recognizing something novel, and I guess that showed up and defeated the experiment.
Yeah, but it makes another point, which is that, as Bob said, functional MRI is a magnificent tool for understanding the human mind. What a fabulous enterprise. It's thrilling. It's a terrible tool for the courtroom, and one of the reasons is that the signals are very, very noisy. They're very messy. We have to work really hard to pull out a signal that we can understand scientifically.
Right.
And it's the easiest thing in the world to defeat that signal by either engaging in mental arithmetic or just moving your head. Right?
Yeah.
To move your head a little bit and the data's garbage.
What's needed, Stephen, to bring evidence like this into the courtroom? What demands are set?
Well, the Supreme Court, in a very influential decision, Daubert, has come up with the standards for scientific evidence, when scientific evidence has reached a level of sufficient validity that it can be admitted into the courtroom. So it looks at things like, has it been peer-reviewed? Does it have a sufficiently well-established error rate? Has it been accepted in the field? But the algorithm is very soft, and it leaves judges a great degree of discretion to decide whether or not the scientific evidence could come in. In other jurisdictions, we have what's known as the general acceptance test. Is it generally accepted by experts in the field? And then you basically are just doing a sociological survey, so to speak, of the experts. The real question, however, is not whether at a certain point we might reach a level of sufficient scientific validity to permit admission. The question would it be an invasion of constitutional rights to compel someone to undergo one of these kinds of scans? And even if it were found constitutional, which I think is very doubtful, then we'd have the problem of countermeasures that Nancy and Bob have talked about. And of course, what the neuroscientists say is, well, we'll be able soon to get good neuromarkers for people trying to use countermeasures, at which point we're going to have an arms race, because then there will be countermeasures to the anti-countermeasures to the anti-counter, and the next thing you know, who knows? But this raises profound legal and ethical questions that I don't think we're yet ready to address because, again, the science for these purposes isn't there yet.
So you think you're doubtful that compelling someone to take a test like this, whether or not it's effective, it would be unconstitutional?
Even if it's effective, it might be unconstitutional. One of the questions would be, since the Fifth Amendment guarantees us a right not to be a witness against ourselves,
yes,
and it's said to prevent testimonial incrimination, would basically looking at a neuromarker that was a proxy for a mental state kind of process, would that be compelled testimony, or would it be simply something like drawing blood to see what the blood alcohol is?
Giving up a sample of your DNA.
That's right.
I mean, if that can place you at the scene of the crime, isn't your own DNA testifying against you?
Well, we make a distinction, and again, it's not a terrifically clear distinction in all cases, between physical evidence and testimonial evidence. So the Supreme Court has said as long as you don't unduly invade a person's body, you can do physical tests like a breathalyzer or taking blood or something of the sort. But this is perilously close to testimonial, and one of the interesting questions, and it's not going to be a scientific question, it's going to be a legal and philosophical question. Is this the sort of thing that the Fifth Amendment is meant to protect us against?
It seems to me I'd be interested to know everybody's notion about this. This occurred to me as you were just saying that. It seems to me there are a couple of kinds of information you can get out of looking into somebody's head. One is if his brain is screwed up in some way, and that contributes to a sense of a state of mind that he might not be so culpable because of, or you watch him or her thinking, and then they're in a sense giving testimony against themselves. Are they separate issues, or what do you think?
I think those are separate issues. Whether someone has some kind of clear brain pathology, whether from lesion or trauma or whatever, I think that is certainly the sort of thing that can be medically well characterized. Then the question would be, what is the relation between that particular form of brain defect or central nervous system defect to the legal question that we're concerned with, which is typically in the criminal justice system? What were the person's actions and mental states? And unless the link was very, very tight between the two, it's not clear what the brain evidence would be adding. So let me give you just a very simple example. Suppose the defendant claimed that he was in the midst of an epileptic seizure when he seemingly assaulted somebody. The fact that we had good EEG, electroencephalographic evidence that the person was subject to, was suffering from epilepsy, since he wasn't in the EEG at the time of the crime, we're not sure. But the fact that he clearly diagnostically suffers from epilepsy would be relevant. The more interesting question is, when you're outside the well-characterized medical or neurological conditions, and we're just talking about other brain processes, whether or not we think they're abnormal, what's the link to the legally relevant behavior, the acts and mental states that the criminal justice is concerned with? And that's the open question that we hope in the future we'll get good evidence for.
I just knocked my microphone off my head. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry to excite you.
I don't know what was going through my head when I did this. You were nodding before when I was trying to make that distinction. What occurred to you?
If we could require criminals to commit their crimes while in the MRI scanner, we would have the state of mind during the crime.
Yeah, no doubt. Anthony Wagner talked about getting signals, activation signals from all over the brain. What can you explain what he meant by that?
So it's just statistical measure where you're looking. You're not, say, just asking, does this brain area light up when the person's lying or whatever. Yeah. You're looking at all the different activity points in the brain and looking for statistical correlations between patterns of those activity points and what the person's saying or doing. I mean, it's not that different than when Amazon tries to draw statistical conclusions about what kind of books you like by the kinds of books you search for and buy and so on. Every time I do it, I go in Google and Google search. There's advertisements pop up based on my.
Why haven't they brought Google into court? If I figure out your whole life from what books you buy, so you get a pattern of all this activity. Sounds like you need a very sophisticated algorithm to find any meaning in that.
The more data you have, the better your algorithms will be. Amazon does much better after you've bought a few books than the first time.
Rather than basing it on one.
Yes, right, exactly.
Bea, you were doing a similar experiment using an MEG device, right? What is that? How does that work?
Well, the MEG is a little bit different from the fMRI. It only provides signal for the cortical surface, and it has a greater temporal resolution, and it provides a signal that's closer to actual neuronal firing.
So the M is magnetic, right, in MEG?
Yes. So it's based on electrical and magnetic currents that emerge from neuronal firing, as opposed to fMRI, which we also do, which is an indirect measure based on blood oxygenation changes due to neuronal firing.
Is it a similar kind of device? Do you get inside a tube, or how does it work?
Yes, you have to electrodes are placed on your head, and you're put inside a machine that will actually measure all the differences in the brain that are occurring while you're doing a task. And in that sense, similar to an fMRI, I mean, as Bob was saying, the whole brain is always working. What we're doing with these experiments are finding relative differences in manipulations that we think are focusing on specific aspects of behavior. And in our studies, in many of our studies, we get this data from looking at a large group of individuals. And that's where I think that there's a very important point to think about of the relationship to informing the law, where we're talking about individuals.
Talk about that. Everybody should join in on that, because that was something that was news to me, as we started doing this. Because probably like a lot of people, I imagined that if something happens here in my brain, that everybody else in this room will have something happen right there in their brain when they're going through a similar experience. But these studies are done as averages of sometimes hundreds of people, I understand. And those averages include different locations for similar activation. Is that right?
That is correct.
So therefore, is it difficult, therefore, to take that average and apply it to an individual?
Right, although we will probably talk about this a little bit later. I think there are times when you can characterize a certain group of individuals, for example, juveniles or so forth, that might be informative, but you might be talking about that a little bit later.
But I just wanted to add to that, you can analyze functional MRI data in different ways. In my lab, pretty much everything we do is analyze individual subjects in great detail. And the reason we do that is precisely that the exact location of those activations differ from subject to subject. So when you do a group analysis, you lose a lot of the exquisite fine-grained structure that's present in any one individual. And so it's a key question with all of these uses of MRI in courtrooms, whether they apply to individuals, because legal issues pretty much always apply to individuals. The Anthony Wagner study, one of the things that was impressive about it was he actually showed in individual subjects that he could do that discrimination, whether the faces were familiar or not. That was one of the things that was impressive about the study. Of course, it was foilable by countermeasures, but some of these studies do work in individuals.
So just to clear this up for me for a second, because I'm not really getting it. What do you get out of the averaging study that you don't get out of the individual, and what do you get out of the individual study that you don't get out of the average?
Okay, so if your question is, do people in general have a particular pattern of activation when they say something false compared to true?
Yeah.
The most standard way to analyze that is to line up a bunch of brains as best you can and look across them and ask whether there's something statistically significant that's consistent across those subjects. Then if it aligns well enough, you can detect that, and that's a standard group analysis. That's the most common thing to do, and that's perfectly legitimate. But that method often loses a lot of the structure that's available in individual subjects. So it is possible frequently to discover things that you see in each subject individually that just will never come through in a group analysis. So it's just two different ways to look at your data.
Yeah, good. Let's get to another clip.
With the individuals, there's so much variability that sometimes you'll find an individual who's not generating
When I was
sort of
talking over,
data.
say that again, with individuals what?
It's not something that is reliable.
Yeah.
So you might find an individual who is not showing the pattern that you would have predicted.
Yes.
So that's where it becomes a little bit more difficult to use in something.
So it
like
sounds
in a
like you're
legal
saying
situation.
we have evidence of an average of a number of individuals. Now we're comparing this individual to that average, but the individual, let's say while lying or recognizing a face, is not having activation that matches the average. So we might draw the wrong conclusion about the individual. Is that roughly what you're saying?
That's one way, but also, you know, in the approach of looking at the individual and trying to predict activity, some individuals are just not reliable in the scanner for a million different reasons.
Like they move too much, or they're asleep. I mean, there's many reasons why one individual's
The problem is not unique to brain imaging. So take a simple example. If you took 100 men and 100 women and averaged their heights, you can be pretty sure that you're going to get a statistically significant difference, that the men will be taller. And that's a real result, and if this weren't obvious, it would be something you could publish. But if you just say, this person is 5'6", are they a man or a woman? You don't know,
good.
right?
Okay.
So you
Science
could have,
made simple for me.
you can have a legitimate scientific result based on group averages that tells you something about differences on average. But then when it comes to taking those statistical distributions that you've discovered and saying something that is reliable about a particular individual, you need a much higher level of diagnosticity. And so there are issues here that are specific to brain imaging, but some of it is just about using group averages to say things about individuals. It's just a perfectly general diagnostic problem.
There is one further question, though, which is, if the question is this person in Group A or Group B? You may not be able to say that with certainty, but given you have group data and this person is a member of that group, what you can say is what's the probability. So with Josh's example, someone's 5'6". What's the probability he or she is a male or a female? And that you can say, and whether that would be something that would be legally useful is an interesting question.
Right.
Although, just as a note, the state of that ability in clinical neuroscience is not very good.
Right,
So, for example, you cannot tell by scanning a subject's brain with MEG, functional MRI, structural scanning, every kind of imaging you want to do. You have beautiful data. You can't tell if that person has autism or not.
Right.
I mean, the most basic things you can't tell by looking at brains. So it's going to be a long time before these things are diagnostic.
Progress is being made. I mean, Helen Mayberg had a recent paper where, I hope I'm getting the details right, she could tell by looking at certain patterns people who have depression, which ones are more likely to benefit from cognitive behavioral therapy versus certain kinds of drugs. And I don't remember the exact numbers.
You could make a prediction about who would benefit from which kind of therapy, and that was borne out. But
I mean, well, this has recently been published, and I think this was done, people who know the study better, done in a prospective way.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, the question would be, will it replicate? When someone else tries to do it in another laboratory, will it be a robust finding or not?
But it sounds like a much safer prediction to make than that this person deserves life in prison because we...
But suppose you were trying to make a decision about whether or not this person is a fit subject for a particular rehabilitation program.
Yes.
And these are expensive. If the person would succeed in rehabilitation, maybe we could release them sooner. If they're not going to succeed, why waste the money on them? It might be a helpful tool someday very far in the future.
Well, let's look at the next clip. In our fictional crime on the program, a convenience store is held up, and while the young man is holding the gun in the face of the clerk's wife comes in to the room from a door on the side of the store. The young man holding the gun turns swiftly and fires the gun, and the bullet lands in her head and pretty much puts her into a vegetative state. Now the question in the trial is whether he shot deliberately or impulsively, and that gets us into a whole other discussion. Take a look.
As Judge Rakoff observed, impulsiveness is a classic adolescent trait. Was Jimmy's 18-year-old brain simply unable to control his recklessly impulsive act?
this is our testing room here.
To find out how a somewhat older brain can control its impulses, I've come to the University of Pittsburgh and the lab of Bea Luna.
Yeah, so sit here, but first look at me so I can explain to you a little bit what we're going to do. What we're testing here are your eye movements, and specifically saccades, which is, in fact, the fastest motor movement that the human body can make.
The saccade just means an eye movement.
So what we're going to do is that I'm going to show you a fixation target. Just look at it. All of a sudden, it's going to go off, and the light's going to appear somewhere. You don't know where it is. And what I want you to do is to look to the opposite location. So it should be something like this. You're going to look at it, a light will appear, and you look the other way. Okay. And let me assure you, monkeys are really good at this test.
They are? Oh, well, then in
it
that
takes
case,
about 6 months of training.
I'm in now. I'm not. Now I'm going to do great. Well, perhaps I'm not so great. It's proving surprisingly hard to drag my eyes away from the light. Hey, you know what this is like? I feel like I'm the boy in the story, and when that yellow light comes in on the left side of the screen or the right side of the screen, I feel like it's the clerk's wife coming into the room, and I can't help but turn to it and shoot a glance at her.
The visual system, the brainstem is all wired up, the attentional system, to look at something that appears in the environment. Yeah. That's what our brain wants to do. So in order for us to not do that, you have to engage executive regions that will say, even though you really want to do that, rest of the brain, I have a plan in executive regions, and our plan is not to look at that. So it's a way for us to be able to look at the integrity of the brain, to be able to engage a plan and take over the impulsive areas of the brain, which is something that develops with, throughout adolescence.
Right. Bea, when we filmed this over a year ago, you were doing work on looking at how emotional arousal might make adolescents even more impulsive. How is that going, that research?
Yeah, we're still analyzing that data, but the hypothesis is that if you increase arousal, it'll undermine the ability to engage the executive processes that you need to prepare to not look at that light.
So what does arousal mean? Does it mean more than I think it means?
Hard to know your mind.
What? I assume that's a technical term.
Well, the idea is that there are subcortical regions in the brain that you can increase their activation with things like emotion or expectation, excitation, and therefore that will bias your behavior one way or another. In this case, we set it up so that it could bias towards being impulsive.
What would be an example of a non-aroused state and an aroused state, the comparison of those two?
You being in the room looking at the lights, that was a non-aroused state. Especially since I wasn't even paying you for doing this. Yeah. At least my subjects would pay for them. But for example, we do that same task where in certain trials we tell adolescents and adults that if they do it correctly, they will get a monetary reward. And when we do that, first of all, we see that all of a sudden adolescents can do this seemingly very difficult task. And just because now they might be able to get a reward. And second, we see that the way that they do this is by increasing the circuitry that would be needed to do this correctly to a higher level than adults need to do. So they're pressing the gas pedal, going a little bit overdrive, because they want to get that reward.
Mm. What about this, what we've all observed? We didn't need scanning to tell us that teenagers are very impulsive.
Exactly.
Why are they so impulsive?
Well, first of all, my favorite philosopher, Edmund Husserl, said that one of the greatest things that science can do is provide evidence for the obvious. And I think when it comes to adolescent research, that's very much the case. Yeah. Yes, we know adolescents are impulsive, blah, blah, blah. What are you telling us that we don't already know? Well, we're providing mechanisms, possible mechanisms of how this could be occurring, with the variability is across development. Of course, not all adolescents are sensation-seeking individuals, although there seems to be a trend across cultures and species that there will be a peak in whatever sensation-seeking that you have that will occur during adolescence that can be very adaptive and so forth. So,
so it's a time for them to try new things, not be afraid of going into new territory, using new tools maybe, but
exactly, yeah.
What's going on in the brain that's allowing that to happen?
Well, that's what we're trying to understand a little bit better. Some of the hypotheses are that there might be neurochemicals like dopamine, which may be peaking during late childhood and adolescence. So these are some of the hypotheses that we're trying to find evidence for. In the animal world, there's already some animal models suggesting this, and we're trying to see if there's actually a more mechanistic explanation for why we might sometimes see, using fMRI, increased activity of these regions like the ventral striatum that has a lot of dopamine, increasing during the adolescent period in comparison to childhood and adulthood.
I think perhaps, Stephen, you mentioned before, I have this in the back of my head, that at that point in their lives, they're looking for models. I don't know if this was in relation to going to jail, but is it true, but let me just ask that as a question. Is it true that adolescents are more susceptible to the behavior or the mentoring of, let's say, somebody in prison? So if you send a teenager to prison, you're putting him more at risk than if you send an older person in terms of recidivism.
I think that we don't need brain science to know that, and we don't have the evidence for that in brain science, but again, common sense and experientially, we know that yes, if for no other reason that you have a longer period to live. But yes, that is a time where you are able to be more influenced by the environment, and I think that that's a part that talks about rehabilitation, in the sense that brain science does continuously find evidence that the adolescent brain, in many different respects, is not at the same level as an adult brain, inferring that there's continued plasticity and the ability to change.
So when does the average brain mature? I mean, we pick numbers like 18, 21, driver's licenses at 16. People could get married in many states, or some states even before that. When do we consider the average brain to mature?
We don't really know, of course. I think with my colleagues, we've often sided with the auto insurance company, which looks at 25 as really reaching maturity. So we don't really know, but of course the closer you get into an older age.
So that's a process of so-called myelination, where the sheath of the white cabling is
right,
getting stronger and growing.
Yes, so myelination continues to increase throughout the lifespan, but for example, in the hippocampus, it'll continue to increase into the 60s. The newer evidence using diffusion tensor imaging, looking at the integrity of white matter, is showing that there might be hierarchical maturation of different pathways, with actually cognitive pathways reaching adult levels within the adolescent period, but those that support social emotional processing continuing to mature perhaps into the 20s or even 30s.
I love what your teenage son said to you when you told him what did you say? Why are you doing this? Why are you behaving like this?
Yeah, he was a young adolescent, and he had been behaving badly. I don't really even remember what he was doing specifically. So I said, I'll talk to him about this tomorrow when he's calmed down. And we talk in the morning, and he's like, Mom, I'm really sorry, but you of all people should know, I'm not fully myelinated. But then I told him, in order for you to myelinate correctly, I have to tell you what the limits are.
Stephen, there have been 2 or 3 Supreme Court decisions in the past few years that had an effect on sentencing, right?
Yes.
Of teenage people, under the age of 18?
Under the age of 18, yes.
Yeah. What's all that about? What
Well,
have they decided?
The question is whether adolescents as a class are sufficiently less culpable that under the Eighth Amendment, Cruel and Unusual Punishment Clause, they should be punished somewhat less as a class. Now, this does not mean that they are not responsible when they commit crimes when they're under 18. It just means, in general, on average, they're less responsible as a group, so maybe their punishment should be mitigated. So in the first of these 3 cases, the Supreme Court said categorically that, in fact, no juvenile could be put to death, no matter for any crime. And then in the second, this case did not cite neuroscience. In the second case, they had to decide whether people could be given life in prison without the possibility of parole for non-homicide crimes. Once again, the Supreme Court said categorically, you cannot do this to juveniles, you cannot give them life imprisonment without possibility of parole for non-homicide crimes. In that case, they did cite neuroscience, but in a very general way, and it wasn't clear that it was necessary, the decision in the case. In the third case, they had to decide whether you could give adolescents life without the possibility of parole for homicide crimes. And here the Supreme Court took a more individualized, nuanced view. They said, yes, you can do it, but you have to have a real showing that this individual kid deserves it. And there was a very strong statement by some of the justices that this would be extremely rare indeed. This case, too, did cite neuroscience in a very general way, but once again, there's a strong argument, and this is controversial, there's a strong argument that the neuroscience was not necessary to the decision in the case. I mean, after all, we've had a juvenile court in the United States for over 100 years. The common law of England previously has treated juveniles differently for centuries and centuries and centuries. As the Supreme Court said in the first case, adolescents are different. Everybody knows that, and that is true. So one of the interesting questions is, what is the brain science here adding? We have 2 groups of people, let's say adults and adolescents, who on average are different in behavioral ways. Would it surprise us that on average, their brains are different in certain ways? It wouldn't surprise us in the slightest. And the question is, what does it really add, except to help us understand the mechanism better, but it doesn't necessarily answer the question, are they responsible or not?
Just on the legal question, though, it's kind of interesting. As we speak, in today's New York Times was an editorial dealing with the question of whether or not it should be retroactive. If you've already sentenced someone's already undergoing a life sentence. Now this decision comes down that you can't from now on sentence kids to a life sentence. Shouldn't it apply in common sense to the people you've already sentenced?
As a moral matter, probably it shouldn't. But as a legal matter, the question is, when should retroactivity govern and when should it not? And that's a very narrow and technical legal question about which courts have split. If the issue is simply a moral question, we've decided kids shouldn't get a particular sentence, then the kids were already serving it. They shouldn't have gotten it either. But that still leaves the narrow legal question of retroactivity open.
And is it your opinion that brain research won't help resolve that question?
No, because the criteria for culpability in law are not brain criteria. They are behavioral criteria. And if we never had a scan, if we had no brain science whatsoever, we could have made the exact same decision about juveniles that the Supreme Court made. And on the death penalty case, they didn't cite the neuroscience. They didn't have to. They cited the behavioral science, they cited common sense, and that was good enough. And here's something really worth noting. Yes, kids are on average more impulsive, although it's worth pointing out, young men and young women are differently impulsive. And what we also notice is, let's just take young males, who are typically more impulsive and commit far more of the crimes. Holding constant, as I think we must, the brain development, there are vastly different crime rates in different places at different times. It's not just the brain that's doing the work. Culture is doing a lot of the work. Yes, kids are more influenced by peer pressure, but the kinds of case that you're using, your fictive case, is much more likely to happen in the U.S. than in a lot of other developed countries.
Bob, I see you nodding.
Oh, I nod to everything.
That's why it's a direct.
Can I have 50 till payday?
And I was going to say, I mean, this whole using neuroscience to make these arguments is such a slippery slope. I mean, as Steve has said, I mean, what's becoming, you know, as brain imaging and brain measurement techniques become more and more powerful, it becomes easier and easier to find statistical differences between different groups. I have no expectation. Sorry, I wouldn't be surprised if Harvard professors had different brains on average than MIT professors, or University of Pennsylvania law professors. I mean, we're getting better at finding these differences.
Yeah.
But then, what conclusion would you draw from that? Why should Steve get off from a crime because he's part of a group that has a different brain structure than me? People will use these arguments in a non-scientific way.
That really raises the question that most of the scientists I've talked to in doing this program love to raise, which is the false notion that you can claim you're innocent because your brain made you do it. And there seems to be a tremendous resistance to that idea. And yet, there is this question of state of mind or the condition you're in. I mean, if you're inebriated and you shoot somebody and you wouldn't have meant to, or you wouldn't have done it if you were sober, if that's determined, doesn't that have something to do with there are layers of culpability, right?
Yeah, of course there are layers of culpability, and what one can say is, as the Supreme Court has said in a case in the late 1990s, if your mental state is affected by the voluntary ingestion of alcohol, tough on you. And now, many states don't take that position, but one certainly could, even though you might not be as rational or capable of rationality because you're drunk. If it's your own fault for getting drunk, the Supreme Court said, a state can exclude the evidence. But suppose you've got some kind of brain condition that affects your behavior. Then, clearly that's assuming you didn't put yourself in that state, let's say, by taking a drug or something of the sort. Then it's not your fault that your behavior has been affected. But once again, the criteria for culpability are behavioral, acts and mental states. If you are a rational person, and we judge that behaviorally, I don't care how bad your brain looks, you're a rational person. And if you are clearly out of touch with reality, and there's no question of malingering, even if we can't find a thing, as Nancy suggested, on a brain scan, you're out of touch with reality, and the law ought to take that into account. As one writer for Nature put it, actions speak louder than images for legal purposes.
Actions speak louder than images, right. Yes.
So I'm going to take the bait. And
Good.
So there are two general justifications for punishment in the legal system, and you might say morally. And one class of them are called utilitarian or consequentialist, which is about producing good consequences in the future, deterring people from committing crimes, incapacitating people who are dangerous, perhaps rehabilitating people. Nothing that we're going to learn from neuroscience is going to undermine those justifications for punishment. But there's another justification which has a long philosophical history, and that's retribution. The idea that part of why we punish, some people say the primary reason why we punish and ought to punish, is simply to give people what they deserve. And I think that this is where a neuroscientific understanding, a mechanistic understanding of human behavior really touches a nerve. When we find out that someone commits a crime and then we find out that they have a brain tumor, we say, oh, it's not, maybe it's not really his fault, it's the brain tumor. Now, a brain tumor is a very obvious thing that you can point to. Well, what if it's a gene that makes somebody more likely to commit a crime? We say, well, statistically it makes that person more likely. We would say, we're not going to let you off. Well, what if I injected you with something that had the exact same effect on your brain as having this gene does in people who just naturally have it? And as a result, our best guess is that you wouldn't have committed that crime had you not had the injection. Now we're going to say, well, is that really your fault? I think it's possible that when you understand behavior as a mechanistic process, it doesn't mean that all of responsibility goes out the window. It doesn't mean there's never a justification for punishing people. But the idea of sticking it to people just because they deserve it as an end in itself, my personal view is that that aspect of our punishment philosophy starts to wither, and that's I think part of the deeper philosophical significance of our emerging mechanistic neuroscientific understanding of human behavior.
So it sounds like you're saying to me that we will see more mitigating considerations as we learn more about the brain and as we can apply that to an individual who's accused of bad behavior. Is that what you're saying?
I think that our feelings are going to be mixed for a long time until we sort them out. And on the one hand, we're always going to recognize the practical need for punishing people, right? And that's never going to go away. And so to really think about this clearly, I think you have to separate those two motivations for punishment, which is not something that we ordinarily do when we just respond intuitively to a case. But I do think that if we all, 5 centuries from now, if we just grow up with just taking it for granted that we're essentially complex chemical constructions and that everything we do is caused by what happened the moment before and the moment before, and we are part of this clockwork universe, I think that does change the way we think about guilt and innocence in a deeper sense.
You bring up retributive justice and the impulse to get retribution, or not even to get retribution, but simply to punish wrongdoing, is a very interesting question. I wonder if any of you are up on this. As I wanted to interview Ernst Fehr in Switzerland, who has done studies on this, about the pleasure derived from punishing people for infractions. I believe I have it right. That kind of, those studies, it seems to me, might throw light on the other side of the legal system, not who's guilty, how should they be punished, but if that runs amok among those of us who are trying to get good behavior to take place, that desire to punish, I wonder if brain studies could help right that situation, maybe help us reduce overactive prosecutors. I don't know, but Nancy, you were shaking your
I don't
head.
know. It's an interesting question. I really like what Josh said, and I'm not sure those imaging studies speak to it. So just for anybody who hasn't run into these are studies where you guys can fill me in if I don't get it quite right. It's Ernst Fehr and Tanya Singer and others, where they have, first they show that they have brain signatures of pleasurable experience, and the idea is that if you watch someone else suffering, you watch someone else feeling pain, you generally activate brain regions that are active when you feel pain yourself. That's the sort of empathy response. But if you have previously played a game with this person and they have cheated nastily, then when you are scanned while watching them suffer pain, then you activate reward pleasure centers. That's the basic finding.
It's true. It's much more entertaining under those
right.
conditions.
So it's the neuroscience of Schadenfreude. Is really what it is. Right? But I think that's very interesting. But I don't think it really divides between this interesting distinction you made. That could be built into humans either for this broader kind of utilitarian kind of goal, or as part of the retribution-based system.
Yeah. Stephen's going to throw his neck out. He's shaking his head so vigorously.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I mean, first of all, retribution is not revenge. I mean, we all have feelings about things like wrongdoing and punishment, but what we try to do is clean up our feelings and give them a good, justifiable basis. Retribution is just a theory that says people should get what they deserve. You worked hard, you got a good grade, you deserve a reward. It's a common sort of reaction we have across the board. Bloodlust is not retribution, and retribution need not be tough. You could be a tender retributivist. That is, you believe people should get what they deserve, but they should get a lot less than we give them. So, for instance, for many of the same crimes that we give extravagantly long sentences, our European allies give much shorter sentences for the exact same sorts of behavior. All right, so retribution is not revenge. Josh, I think, has made what is a sociological observation rather than an argument in favor of getting rid of retribution. What he said is basically, if we become convinced that we're just mechanisms, as he once put it very provocatively, we are merely victims of neuronal circumstances, then our notion that people deserve anything will wither away. That might be true. I hope it won't be true. It might be true. But the question is, should it wither away? Is it ever likely that we will think of ourselves merely as victims of neuronal circumstances? And if we do, would we even be thinking about something like punishment anymore, as opposed to simply controlling beneficent or malevolent people?
Well,
I mean, punishment is a moral concept.
Doesn't that raise the question of whether or not punishment is an appropriate response to behavior?
That's a moral question.
Yeah, well,
it's both a moral question and a practical question.
Yeah, and it also might benefit from more brain research. But Josh,
Yeah, so I disagree with Stephen's characterization. Everybody agrees that we should give people what they deserve in some sense. The question is, what's our standard for calibrating desert? Now, if you're a consequentialist, you'll say, well, what you deserve is the kind of punishment that overall produces good consequences across society. But the idea of retribution is punishment as an end in itself, over and above the practical value that it may have. Now, what we're familiar with psychologically are our feelings. And I think, as Nancy suggested, and I think this is right, those feelings evolved biologically and have been tuned by culture, probably because punishment is useful, because it has practical effects. But sometimes our feelings outstrip the usefulness of the feeling. So take a familiar example. Why does food taste good? Why is sex sexy, right? The reason why we're attracted to certain things is because of the value that they have. But that doesn't mean that there's a perfect match between those things. Something can be delicious and it can be poisoned, right? Or you can find someone or something attractive and it's not necessarily good for you to go for it. So the question is not, will we ever get rid of our feelings that undergird both retribution and that have a kind of practical rationale behind them. The question is, when we slow down, when we stop and think, are we going to justify doing things in terms of things other than just the consequences? So to give a parallel example, we've learned from 20th century physics that space-time is curved. Now, when you're going through the grocery store, that doesn't mean you're thinking about the curvature of space-time. It seems perfectly flatly Euclidean, and it always will until we rewire our brains. But if you're going to send a rocket ship into space, then you need to take into account the theory of general relativity. In the same way, I have no doubt that in our day-to-day personal interactions, we're going to consider people responsible for what they do and praise them for the good things they do and sneer at them for the bad things that they do. But when it comes to putting somebody to death, the sort of, I think, legal equivalent of sending a rocket ship into space where the stakes are really high, then do we want to be relying on those feelings, or do we want to think really just about the consequences themselves? And I would favor the latter.
But then what if, as many people claim, the death penalty deters?
If
the death penalty does deter.
Right,
go for it. No, I say we
right?
don't go
That's not...
for it, because I say it is such an infringement of human dignity, without regard to whether the consequences would be good or bad, that we simply shouldn't do it, even if we could show it perhaps saves some lives. And it seems to me that once you decide to go purely consequential, we don't want to turn this into a philosophical discussion. If you move Josh's way, you run into all the familiar objections to consequentialism. How do we actually balance those costs and benefits? How do we know what's the proper time frame? Till the heat death of the universe? Till next year? So there are familiar problems with consequentialism. There are familiar problems with, retribution as an end in itself. What we know are both our features of how we morally approach the question of what should we do to people when we're the state and they've done wrong. And I don't think either is going to leave our moral vocabulary or our practices.
I think someday we'll have this conversation where both of you are in scanners and we'll learn an enormous amount, more than from what you're saying.
There's going to be a lot of frontal activation in both of us, I'll tell you that.
I think this next clip has some bearing on this. One of the points we try to make in Brains on Trial is that the insights neuroscience is providing is how our brains work mostly applying only to group averages, which we mentioned before. And as we said tonight, someone who doesn't want to have their brain scanned can confuse the scan. And take a look at this clip, because I think some of it bears on what we've been talking about.
This question, whether a brain scan could ever truly plumb someone's mind if they were out to defeat it, is central to whether neuroscience will ever have a role in the courtroom in making judgments about individuals. But the insights of neuroscience into the teenage brain do help explain why young people in general can engage in foolish and dangerous acts. We saw from Jay Geed's studies that a brain like Jimmy's is likely still to be incompletely wired up. From Bea Luna that a teenage brain is unready for the prep work needed to avoid making split-second mistakes, especially in emotionally charged situations. And from Larry Steinberg that reward centers in the teenage brain can be put into high gear when friends are around. All of which raises the question,
are we in danger of saying that, as far as culpability is concerned, that he's not really guilty, his brain made him do it?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the more important sort of debates about how neuroscience can inform the law. That you don't want to get to the level of making the separation of my brain made me do it and not me. That's why I'm always saying it should never be the critical aspect of the law, which is an ethical issue. It should just be an informative piece, as many other informative pieces might be.
So I don't think that we can sort of use it as an excuse to not be accountable, but I think it can influence what we do moving forward, what sort of environment they should be in that keeps society safe, but that the probably worst imaginable would be to put them in with other people that are older and criminals, because this is a time when the brain is looking for peers and modeling to know what to do.
Josh, you co-authored a book that had in its title, For the Law, Neuroscience Changes Nothing and Everything. What did you mean by that?
Well, so that paper was really getting at the issues that we've been going back and forth on here. It's certainly, I won't defend the view that says my brain made me do it, implying that there's a me that's separate from the brain. I mean, that's just a mistake. And I think that's the mistake that most neuroscientists really want to make sure people don't make. What I will say, to sort of paraphrase what I said before, is that when you understand that ultimately every decision you make is a function of mechanical processes in your brain, which are themselves functions of prior mechanical processes all the way going back to the Big Bang, that may have an effect on how you view free choice and responsibility. Not that it means that all of responsibility goes out the window, that punishment is never justified, but it might mean that some of our practices are, well, they'll start to seem counterproductive or even immoral when we recognize that there isn't a guilty or innocent soul in there, independent of the physical
That gets
machinery.
very murky with regard to responsibility. How many of you here who are brain scientists feel that we are, in fact, capable of making choices about our behavior, and regardless of the impulses that come up in our head, regardless of our experience, except in extreme cases of mental illness, are we or aren't we capable of free choice, or what used to be called free will? Still is.
I'm a strong believer in that. I think, maybe I would put what Josh is saying in a different context. Look, if you look at our prisons, they're filled with people who are disadvantaged in so many ways. You know, they may have had an inadequate childhood. They may suffer from low IQ. They're filled with people with mental illness, many people with addictions. I mean, many bad things, all of which are going to affect their brains, okay? That should not bear on the question of guilt or innocence. It should not bear on these questions of free will. it should bear on our questions of what do we do with all these people? Just stick them in a cell and do nothing and then hope that 20 years later they come out and they're cured? I mean, it leads you towards better treatment for the mentally ill, better programs for people suffering from addictions, and so on and so on and so on. That's the way I think where we should be putting our efforts, on the consequences end, not on the guilt or innocence end, because then you're just undermining our whole philosophical system. You're undermining everything about how we think about human beings when you start doing that.
It sounds like that's a case for bringing brain research into the
yes, where it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be on this other end of excuse. See, brain research provides an explanation for our behavior. It doesn't provide an excuse for our behavior. I think that's the way of looking at it.
Nancy, you were shaking your head.
Well, I was just going to say that a lot of what we're calling brain research is really psychology research, right? So in some cases, actually looking at brains informs some of these questions we're talking about, but an awful lot of what we're talking about, for example, the things Bob just mentioned, the effects of being born, with low SES or low IQ or fetal alcohol syndrome or you name it, these are things where actually behavioral studies will be at least as informative, I'd guess probably more informative than anything you can do looking at brains. So it's sort of a clarification that we're using brain science, but really a lot of what we're talking about is just psychology.
Bea, what do you think? Are we mostly responsible for what we do, regardless of the influence?
I completely believe in free will, but that could be a religious belief for all I know. But when I've had to think about this and write about this with reference to adolescence, I very much, I think, side with what I've been hearing here, in the sense that I've never felt comfortable with informing the culpability aspect of it. And I've often been asked to be an expert witness, and I've always said no, because obviously the crime was committed. Where I did feel that the type of research that my colleagues and I do could inform, and I know that psychological studies also show, but I think it gives it more strength, is the extent of sentencing. And I was involved in some of these Supreme Court briefs where the sentence was the rest of your life for a 16-year-old. Obviously, for many ethical reasons, it doesn't make sense, but I think that the brain science was able to give some more weight to the psychological evidence by saying, look, here we have real evidence that the brain is changing, and this individual might be a different individual 10 or 20 years. Not saying slap their hands and let them go, but really focusing on the fact that perhaps the rest of your life might be too long, and that rehabilitation might be an area that we need to focus because the brain is changing, and check on them 10, 20 or something years, or find ways that you can psychologically or so forth identify who has been rehabilitated, which we know very little about, and I think it would be an area where we could make some advances that could help the situation.
Stephen, we mentioned Josh's writing on this subject. You wrote a paper that got a lot of attention called Brain Overclaim Syndrome.
Yes.
You found a real problem with the brain research?
Yeah, I'm in the great tradition of American psychiatry of making up new syndromes and suggesting them as provisional. What often happened was some of the advances in brain science and neuroscience done by the people on this panel are stunning. It's fabulous science, and I'm as impressed as anybody with it. The question always is, what's its actual relevance to legal questions as opposed to its rhetorical relevance? The pretty pictures, are they convincing, et cetera, et cetera. And what I saw was a lot of people made claims about legal relevance that were simply far beyond what the science had to offer. And this was not in any way a critique of the science, because after all, especially with fMRI, it's a relatively young science. It's working on one of the hardest problems there is in all of science, the relationship between the brain, the mind, and action. Most of the studies have not been done to address legal questions. So the fact that there wasn't a lot yet that was relevant to law was neither surprising nor upsetting. But people were nonetheless making claims that were not justified. And what I said was basically, curb your irrational enthusiasm and try to show me precisely how this neuroscience finding actually answers a legal question. Show me the chain of inference. And if you can't do that yet, then fall silent until you can. That was the point.
Now, my impression from most of the people I've talked with, the vast majority of the people I've talked to, is an avoidance of overclaiming.
They've gotten much better. Because I recommended cognitive gerotherapy, and I think many have taken the course.
Well, so far I've been asking all the questions, and you might have been thinking, I have a question, why isn't he asking it? Why don't you join the conversation now, the folks in the room, and ask what you'd like of our panel. Who's got a question? We have microphones, so we'll hear you on the video cameras in addition to in the room. I think you convinced everybody of both sides of the argument. Anybody? Right. What's the constitution of the crowd tonight? Are you made up of people from both brain science and the law, the legal studies? How many people are schooled in brain science tonight? Yeah, a few. How about people in the legal profession? Yeah, more, I think. Huh?
And how many are here because they're MASH fans?
What?
Because they're MASH fans.
Good question.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so no questions. Yes, okay, good.
Oh, there's one.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see you.
My question is, have you conducted research that basically compares brain activity for an individual that has committed a tort intentionally or to show that they have committed it through negligence? And what were the results, if you have?
Oh, I'll take a. I mean, it's a good question, but it'd be a very hard study to do, because what would you do? What you could, I suppose, have the person think about what they did. Because of course you're scanning them long after the event, right? There may be, as Bob said, if you arrange for everybody to commit their crimes in a scanner, that's a different ballpark, right? But most of the time that's not the situation, and so you'd be scanning them way after. So what would you do? Well, you could ask them to think about the time when the event happened. But it just seems extremely unlikely to me that you'd get any signature of intent way after the fact, just trying to think about it. I don't know. Do you guys disagree? It just seems hopeless.
There is no study that addresses your question directly. The distinction you've drawn between doing something on purpose and causing a result because you were careless is also an important distinction in criminal law. If you kill somebody on purpose, it's a much worse crime than if you kill them by being careless. So one of the things that I'm engaged in now as part of a research team trying to determine if we can find a neural signature that distinguishes between knowing the result you're going to cause and being consciously aware of a risk that you're going to cause it. And it turns out to be, as Nancy has suggested, this is enormously difficult to do, even in a controlled laboratory experiment, to sort of set up the research design so that you're clearly distinguishing between these two mental states in the stimulus, and then seeing if you can find the neural signature is extraordinarily difficult to do, and we're in the midst of seeing if we can do it.
I'll just add one little thing, which is, this is less relevant to the kind of court situation, but there is a magnificent result recently published by Rebecca Sachs and Jory Custer-Hale, who are out here, where they show that it's not that you can detect a signature of intent versus accidental harm, but you can detect a signature brain distinction in a person thinking about whether someone else's actions, harms, were intentional or accidental. You can see that different signature just when you're thinking about someone else's actions, which is quite remarkable, but it doesn't help us in this immediate legal
We have a
case.
question over here.
Thank you. This has been really interesting. So the panel discussed the problematic nature about applying aggregated data to groups, from groups to individuals. And I'm very sympathetic to Professor Morris's qualification of that if we shift to thinking of probabilities, but I wanted to push it a little bit further. So how is comparing an individual to a standard based on data from a group average different from comparing that individual to a legal standard like the reasonable man, which is appealed to determine the validity of a provocation defense in some jurisdictions? So if we think it's acceptable to ask if a reasonable man would have been provoked, and if the reasonable man would have done as the defendant did in this situation, why can't we ask whether the group average man would have been provoked, and whether the group average man would have done as the defendant did?
The analogy, the question in the analogy is a good one, but it is a slightly different question. If we ask just as a statistical matter, is this person behaving, or what's the likelihood that they're behaving as an average person would, that's a real statistical question. Reasonable person standards in law are not a statistical standard. They are a moral standard. We're asking, what can we expect of each other? And the reasonable person in law is not a person at the 50th percentile. It's, have you reached a standard of what we expect of an ordinary ethical citizen? It's probably, if we were to think of it statistically, far below the mean. Because after all, half the people in the population are below the mean statistically. And if the mean were what were required, half the people would not be responsible. So the reasonable person standard is actually a relatively low standard in law, and it's not a statistical standard. It's a moral standard. We're asking the jury to decide, under the circumstances, would an ethical person have behaved that way?
But when you see how most people react after someone's elected president, it's clear that there's no such thing as a reasonable man.
No comment.
We have somebody here. Thank you.
Yes, I'm considering our present judicial system where we have a jury of a person's peers who have to decide whether the defendant is telling the truth. And I envision a situation in the future where science has come to the point where you put a defendant through an fMRI or a similar, maybe more sophisticated scan, and you find out that he is really telling a lie, and the truth is he's guilty. Do we need the judicial system? Would you comment on that?
Well, you feel that the judicial system works and the another thing doesn't, right?
Yeah, right.
Well, yeah. Look, the judicial system, proof beyond a reasonable doubt in a criminal trial is obviously not beyond all doubt. We're human beings, we're fallible. There are 12 people on the jury, they talk, and we hope that their diversity and their wisdom together will come to a decision that we can be morally comfortable with, although we know there is a non-trivial chance that they've gotten it wrong. Now, certain kinds of scientific techniques can help make that decision-making more accurate. I give you DNA, and that really helps us make decisions. With lie detection, the interesting question is whether or not we will be able to compel somebody. So, for instance, today in the criminal justice system, you can't use the polygraph, and this was even before it became clear that the polygraph was as inaccurate as it is. And there are all sorts of constitutional questions and ethical questions about why that should be so. What will happen if we get so much better and so much more accurate? How will our legal system change in response to that? It would just simply be a sociological speculation on my part. Will we treat neural lie detection the way we treat DNA, or will we treat it much more like forcing someone to confess by putting them under the rack and screw?
We have a question over here.
Yeah, so I was thinking about maybe another trial, perhaps not a criminal trial, where our brains would be put, because this kind of scans sound to me like something that workplaces would really love. They were able to stick you in a machine and in an hour get a report that says that this person is innovative and creative and you can really do the work well, but this person not so much. Sounds to me like this is something that people would really love to use. And it's also a legal issue because it will bring all the, discrimination lawsuits, etc. So, what do you think about this kind of use? Have you heard anything about interest in this? And also, I think it comes back to what Professor Green was saying about whether we can really be, distilled to these mechanical, neurons firing in our brain to be evaluated for how well we can do? Or is there something beyond?
What are your responses to that?
Well, I actually think that you can address this issue without getting into the dicey metaphysical stuff. There is no doubt that there will be things about your brain that are measurable, that are correlated with behaviors of interest. And the question is simply how tight are those correlations now? How tight will they be in the future? And how much of interest are those behaviors? It wouldn't surprise me if you could look in people's brains and make a better than chance guess about whether they'd be good at this or good at that. And there's some evidence for this. So there's this fantastic study done a few years ago looking at London cab drivers. And the reason why they studied London cab drivers is because there'd been a lot of work in rats running mazes. So there was a lot of neuroscience known about navigation and memory for places laid out in space. And say, well, who are the king rats of the human world? London cabbies have this incredible map of all of London in their heads. And sure enough, they found that the London cabbies had bigger hippocampi, important parts of the brain widely studied in this building, than other people. Now, it could be because of their experience. It could be because of some kind of selection pressure on them. You got a big hippocampus, into the cab you go. But either way, the correlation was quite robust. So if you're running a cab company, you might get some traction already today. And it's just a question of what's coming down the road.
I'm going to largely disagree.
Okay.
And that is, that London cab driver study is lovely. We all teach it in undergrad classes. It's great fun. But the effect sizes are minuscule. And brain imaging studies are extremely expensive and difficult to run. They're not practical. I would submit that in a 10-minute behavioral test that costs approximately nothing, you would learn a whole lot more.
I don't disagree.
And I think that's one of the important points. When it's just, for example, in your scenario, when is it better to just have a conversation with someone and ask them and get the information? And when does neuroscience, when is it able to give you something that you were not able to get at that point? So for those circumstances, I even thought about it for a second, like, grad students. But then I thought, I get so much more from having a really great interview, getting layers of references, etc. So I think that that's something that we really need to think about.
I'm not sure.
When can we really add with neuroscience?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's a single case. I can't think of a single case where if I wanted to know something of real-world significance, whether to admit a grad student, who's skilled on what, anything that I would care about, that I would look at brain data over behavioral data. Probably not a single case.
Well, but if you take lie detection, the standard lie detectors, though, as a case point, the federal government is a huge user of polygraphs. Many companies using polygraphs. And the statistics are that the polygraph is accurate about 70% of the time. For a lot of businesses, that's just fine. If they make 30% errors, that's just fine. It's terrible, but from their point of view, a sloppy, inadequate method that's a little bit better than chance increases their odds.
All I'm saying is they do a whole lot better with behavioral measures, right? You want implicit measures of what people really think. Use Masreen Banaji's IAT test. There's many behavioral tests that can tap into implicit things. They're probably all more powerful. And the real reason that people use polygraphs is not because they're going for that 70% predictability, but for the reason that Alan mentioned a while back, which is that when people are hooked up to a polygraph, they think they have to tell the truth. That's the real reason they're still used. That's why
I sense a little consensus here on the question of if you can actually add value, then it's good, and if you can't, hold back. Everybody seems to be in the... Would you agree, Josh?
Yeah, no, I agree. The question is, there's just no law of neuroscience that says neuroscientific evidence can never add value to behavioral evidence. That may be true across the board right now, but I have no doubt that there will come a day where there's some kind of neuroscientific test that, when used to supplement whatever behavioral evidence we have, adds some value.
I get the impression you leave the door open for that possibility, too.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, there's a recent study that's legally relevant that is worth mentioning in this regard. We talked about predictions before. we make predictions all the time in the criminal justice system, and we have behavioral measures for doing them, some of which are better validated than others. The question would be, if we added a brain scan, would we get any value added in making that prediction more accurate? Until this year, there has not been one study that has addressed that question directly prospectively. The first study was published in April, I believe it was, of this year, basically looking at arrest records of people who had been scanned and seeing whether anything on the scan could predict 5 years out whether or not they would recidivate. And it turned out that the effect size was very, very small, and arrest records are not a perfect measure, and it didn't compare to the very best behavioral measures, but nonetheless, there was a statistically significant increase in the predictive ability of the researchers to predict who would recidivate, according to arrest records, 5 years out. It's not nearly ready for prime time, but as far as I'm concerned, that's a really good proof of concept study that shows how neuroscience might someday in the future, when it's better replicated, better validated, and remember again, as Nancy said, these are incredibly expensive things to do. How much value added do you need to start scanning prisoners on a recidivism? So if you're getting a tiny, tiny effect, is it worth it? But it is proof of concept.
I think we have time for only one more question, so I apologize to those people waiting. I hope this is really good. It's the last one.
The pressure's on.
I'm feeling the pressure.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you for the discussion. I found it really fun and interesting to hear. Throughout the discussion, it seems that we've touched on psychology and neuroscience, as well as philosophy. And given the evolution of these three fields, and legal studies as well, given the evolution of these fields, they seem to be merging quite interestingly. And does the future grad student or the future undergrad student need to study both the moral implications of their neuroscience or psychology, as well as neuroscience, or the legal implications of all three of these things?
There's a lot of interest in even having classes, discussion groups, and so on about the moral implications of what we do, the ethical issues raised by what we do, the legal issues of what we do. So you've cited what is really the current trend, which is in fact to educate neuroscientists much more about these sort of issues. I don't know whether there's a fair effort to educate the lawyers.
Oh, no, there is.
Okay, well, that's good. That's good.
No, in fact, courses in quote-unquote neurolaw are proliferating. There's a case book about to come out in neurolaw that's aimed at law students. We at Penn have a program where law students can get training in neuroscience. And so Bob is right. There is a lot of cross-disciplinary fertilization. And I think it's very important that when we're talking about public policy, that the lawyers know something about the neuroscience and the neuroscientists know something about the law.
The Judicial College also yearly invites people that have to do the brain so the judges can better understand how to take in this type of information. So I think there's a lot of cross-disciplinary.
And I think if people watch this program, Brains on Trial, they'll see this conversation taking place between neuroscientists and people in the legal profession, and all of them concerned about both new knowledge and not hurting the justice system by prematurely bringing in or allowing in research that doesn't necessarily provide value added. I want to thank the panel for tonight, and I thank all of you for watching. And I want to extend an invitation to you to take a look at not only these two programs on our website, but hours, many hours of material that never made it on the air, and just as interesting, just as fascinating as the material that did get on the air. You can look at it at brainsontrial.com. That's our website, where, for instance, you can find Nancy telling us more about the limits of fMRI, Josh and his colleague Joe Paxton doing the experiment with me on how people choose whether or not to lie, extended conversations that I had with both Josh and Stephen, and an experiment I took part in that suggests my brain makes decisions without my really knowing I'm doing it, which is pretty weird. And right now, it's just me making the decision to thank you all for coming and to the McGovern Institute, and to Bob Desimone for having us. Thank you so much.
Just want to. Thank you, Alan, very much. And also, I want to invite the audience that there's coffee and cookies over here, and there's literature on the McGovern Institute.
The Sloan Foundation.
And the Sloan Foundation for half of those cookies.
Thank you all. Thank you. That was just
Oh, that was great, Alan. Really great.